I stood at the edge of the ballroom, my emerald satin dress quietly reflecting the glow of the crystal chandeliers overhead. The 30th anniversary celebration of Moreland & Sons was being held at a five-star hotel in New York, where my father-in-law, Charles Moreland, confidently announced the company's new global expansion strategy. And also where I, Arya Moreland, the daughter-in-law he never accepted, was pushed to the edge of an irreversible truth. I knew Charles had never trusted me, a girl from Indiana, graduate of a small arts college, who turned down his job offer and instead opened a small interior design studio. Studio, as he often sneered, is just a fancy word for an unprofitable hobby. But that evening he didn't stop at dismissive glances. As red wine filled crystal glasses, Charles stood up, smiled charmingly at the crowd of investors, partners, and media, then looked straight at me like he was ready to throw a verbal punch. The Moreland family has always valued dedication and performance. We don't believe in pipe dreams or so-called artistic startups. Unfortunately, he shrugged, even within the family, we have a living example of that. The room let out a low chuckle. My husband, Ethan, sat beside me, silent, his eyes avoiding mine as if he, too, was embarrassed by my presence there. I clenched my fists, but before I could say a word, an older man at the head table stood up, his face calm, but his eyes cutting through the tension like fog. "If I may," he said, his voice firm and commanding enough to hush the room. "I'm Henry Gallagher, founder of Gallagher & Stone, one of the leading interior architecture firms on the East Coast." Charles froze, his smile vanished. "And by the way," Henry turned toward me, "Arya hasn't just been the lead designer on my last 3 projects, she's also my daughter." The room went still. Charles's glass trembled slightly. Ethan turned to me, eyes wide, stunned. "Yes, Arya is my daughter," Henry continued. "I didn't say anything earlier because I wanted to see what she could accomplish on her own. Not with my name, and certainly not with the Moreland name." I couldn't take my eyes off him. This was the man who disappeared from my life before I finished high school. The man my mother never spoke of, only saying he wasn't ready to be a father. And "I'm very proud," he said slowly, his gaze locked on Charles, "because Arya rose above all the judgment and bias to become someone I never dared to hope I could one day call my child." Silence. Charles had no words. He tried to force a smile, but the investors had already begun whispering, some exchanging looks as if they'd just seen the first crack in what once seemed like an unshakable empire. As for me, for the first time in my life, I didn't need to defend myself. Henry's words were a shield, but also a door to a brand new chapter. I didn't know what would come next, whether Ethan would stand by me or walk away for good, but I knew that from that moment on, I would no longer be the unworthy bride in the Moreland family. After the event, Ethan and I left the hotel in silence. He drove through the night streets of Manhattan, headlights casting soft glows across his face, the face that once moved me, now a cold distance I could no longer reach. "You didn't tell me he was your father," Ethan finally said after nearly 20 minutes. His voice wasn't angry, just bitter. I turned to him. "I didn't hide it. I only found out a few weeks ago. I hadn't even processed it when your father turned me into entertainment in front of the entire investor circle." Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter, eyes fixed on the road. "And you chose to side with him? Right in front of my dad? In front of everyone?" That question didn't need an answer, but I replied anyway, softly. "I didn't side with anyone, I stood for myself." Since I married Ethan, I'd learned to stay quiet at family gatherings, at parties where people toasted the Moreland legacy, never once asking about my dreams. Charles always called my studio a youthful experiment, urging me to wake up soon and accept a role in the company's marketing department. A stable job, more meaningful than arranging couches for strangers. At first, Ethan defended me, gently telling his father that I needed time to build my own brand. But over time that defense faded, then vanished. He started repeating Charles's words. Almost verbatim. "Arya, you've given it a shot. If it's not working, what's wrong with trying a different path? My dad can set you up with steady work, regular income. We could think about a bigger house, maybe even a child." "Are you talking about your dream or your father's?" I had asked during a fight 6 months ago. And since then, Ethan stopped having deep conversations with me about work. Every time I mentioned a new client or an exciting project, he'd just nod absently. like I was talking about a hobby he no longer cared to follow. I didn't blame him entirely. Charles's influence was no small thing. The man had a way of making people doubt themselves, polished, polite, but suffocatingly authoritative. I still remember a night in January, after I declined an offer to design the company's showroom. Charles invited me to his office. He sat behind a massive desk, placed a contract in front of him and said, "Arya, you don't have to fight. We could work together. But if you insist on chasing this little path of yours, sooner or later, Ethan will get tired." I looked at him, seeing all the layers of power gleaming beneath his calm expression. "I don't need you to define success for me. And Ethan, if he gets tired of me being myself, that's not my fault." That's when I knew I had to be stronger than ever. And now, with my biological father, Henry Gallagher, unexpectedly stepping in, not to save me, but to acknowledge me as part of his world, I realized I was no longer alone. I didn't need anyone's permission to chase my dream, and I didn't need anyone's approval to be worthy. Ethan brought me home. To what used to be our home. Now just an empty shell. I stepped out of the car, turned back to him one last time before heading inside. "You can keep standing behind your father, Ethan," I said, not with bitterness but clarity, "but I won't. I won't be a background character in someone else's story, not even for someone I once loved." Ethan said nothing, only his eyes, torn and uncertain, followed me until the elevator doors closed. I didn't know what would become of us. But one thing was certain. I would never go back to being the quiet, overlooked wife in the Moreland family again. I didn't sleep that night. Though the city lights outside the window still blazed, inside me was a vast darkness, confusion, pain, and a curiosity I couldn't quiet. The next morning, a cream envelope on my desk stopped me in my tracks. No return address. Just, "To Arya," handwritten in firm, familiar script. I slowly opened it. Inside was a sheet of embossed stationery, with a few carefully written lines. "Arya, I know I have no right to appear so suddenly at that event, but I couldn't stay silent while people disrespected my daughter. If you're open to a conversation, not between professionals but between a father and his child, come to the Lantern on Saturday 10 a.m. I'll be waiting. Henry?" I held the letter for a long time. I had never imagined that the man who walked away from my mother and me would turn out to be Henry Gallagher, the same man who'd been on the cover of Architect Digest just months ago, shining in a world I had always admired from afar. I told Aunt Rosa, who raised me after my mother passed. She fell silent for a moment, then sighed. "Your mother once said, if one day you're strong enough to face him, then you have every right to do it. Not to forgive, but to understand why." Saturday. I arrived at the Lantern 10 minutes early. The little cafe sat at the end of a tree-lined street in Brooklyn, in vintage glass windows and deep brown leather chairs. Henry was already there, sitting in the corner with a nearly empty cup of espresso in front of him. I walked over. He stood up immediately, a little awkward. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hi, sir," I replied, unsure what to call him. We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us said a word. His eyes quietly studied me, like he was trying to find pieces of a memory he'd lost for 28 years. "I didn't come here for an apology," I said, calm but firm. "I came to understand why you left." Henry nodded. "I won't make excuses, but I'll be honest." He told me about his younger days, a dreamer, obsessed with design and big ideas, but completely unfit for building a family. When my mom got pregnant, he panicked. "I didn't think I could be a father. I thought, if I stayed away, you and your mother would be better off." I listened without interrupting. Each sentence he spoke opened a door to a past I'd never known. I was wrong, and I've known that every day for the past 28 years. We sat in silence again. But it wasn't an empty space. It was a quiet place where we could finally hear each other. "You're in interior design," he asked, his eyes lighting up. "You have a very distinct aesthetic." I smiled faintly. I'm not sure where it came from, but when I was a kid, I used to sketch rooms from my imagination on paper. "Like your mom," he said softly. "She had a gift for making everything feel balanced." We began to talk more, about work, about modern design fused with cultural roots, about projects I had admired for years, only to now learn he was the mind behind them. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel out of place talking about my passion. "I know you don't need me," Henry said as I was about to leave, "but if you'll let me, I'd like to be part of your world. Not because we share blood, but out of respect for the strong woman you are." I nodded, no promises, but no refusal either. As I stepped out of the cafe, the late morning sun touched my shoulder, soft but warm. I didn't know where this would go, but I knew this conversation was the first step toward understanding myself better, my roots, my drive, and why I felt so deeply connected to beauty, structure, and emotion in space. A week after that meeting at the Lantern, I received an email from Henry. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk." We met again in a private conference room at Gallagher & Stone's headquarters, 27th floor, overlooking the Hudson River. This space was nothing like the cozy cafe. It carried the weight of strategy and power, and I knew today's conversation wasn't just about family. "Do you know why I didn't bring this up the first time?" Henry asked, opening his laptop and scrolling through a few documents before stopping on a supply chain map. "Because you thought I'd say no?" I asked, my eyes scanning the data on the screen. "Because I wanted to be sure you were here for yourself, not for me," he replied. "But now it's time you knew." He turned the screen toward me. "This is Moreland Corporation's global supply chain for the Heritage Luxe line, their flagship strategy for the European market next year. 3 critical pillars: exclusive 3D pattern printing tech from Altatech, silk, sourced from Lyon under a 5-year contract, and finally their luxury leather supplier, Maison Villiers, France." Her social media post asked for updates. I frowned. "But Villiers only partners with one designer each year. You said they were extremely selective." Henry nodded. "And this year they haven't chosen anyone yet." I looked at him, starting to understand. "Arya," he said slowly, "Moreland is betting everything on this line. If they lose Villiers, they'll have to switch to substitute leather, meaning they'll lose brand positioning and fail to meet premium distribution standards in Milan, Florence, and Vienna. That would derail Charles Moreland's entire European expansion plan." I sat still, my heart beat faster. Not out of revenge, but because the truth was finally laid bare. "I don't want to manipulate you, but if you want to prove what you're capable of, this is your moment." A few days later, I flew to Paris to meet with Maison Villiers' representative, Madame Céline Dufort, a silver-haired woman, elegant with piercing, powerful eyes. We met in a sunlit room inside their Les Marais showroom, where antique leather books and handmade samples were displayed like art. "We've heard of you," Madame Céline said, her French accented English calm and graceful. "Studio Arya Design has done some notable boutique projects in New York." I presented my concept for the Urban Heritage Collection, reimagining historic architecture through modern interiors, using natural leather as the focal point. I didn't mention Moreland. I only talked about myself, my blend of heritage and individuality, of tradition and reinvention. Céline turned each page of my sketchbook, nodding occasionally. "You seem to understand the soul of the material rather than trying to show it off," she remarked. "As someone from fashion, I've seen many use leather as a status symbol, but with you, it has depth." I didn't respond. I knew I was being evaluated not just for my design, but for my integrity. Before I left, Céline said gently, "I'll be in New York next week. If you're open to it, I'd like to visit your studio. We want to work with someone who truly understands and honors craftsmanship." When I shared the meeting with Henry on a video call, he smiled. "You never had to mention Moreland, and still won them over." "That's exactly what I hoped for." I looked at him, finally feeling like an equal, not because I was about to shake Charles's empire, but because I was rising on my own terms, with skill, resolve, and vision. "What's the next step?" I asked. "Céline will open the door," Henry said, his tone more serious. "But to take down Charles, we'll need to hit his biggest weakness, his ties to a firm called Bryson Lowell. If we cut off that funding—" I interrupted, smiling slightly. "Then let's start mapping the next move." From that moment on, I knew this was no longer about a dismissed daughter-in-law. This was the journey of a woman once seen as the wrong choice, quietly building her own counterattack. 3 months after my first meeting with Madame Céline, Arya Design moved into a sunlit mezzanine in Soho, New York. No longer the cramped apartment studio with squeaky floors. The new space had exposed brick walls, tall ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling glass, exactly like the sketches I made in my sophomore year of college. Everything came like a wave. Fast, strong, unstoppable. After Maison Velliere announced Arya Design as their exclusive interior design partner for North America, I received 7 collaboration offers within 2 weeks. A boutique hotel in Charleston, a chain of electric car showrooms in Seattle, even a restaurant project in London's financial district. Henry stayed in the background, never touching the art or aesthetic, but quietly supported strategy and funding through his investment firm, D&G Ventures. Under the guise of a creative fund, D&G provided the capital for me to hire 6 new staff members, invest in automated model production, and more importantly, position Arya Design as a rising name to watch in architectural review and interiors and spaces. At the same time, tremors started shaking Moreland's foundation. I read that Charles Moreland had just been denied a flagship lease in Milan. The property management group, once his loyal partner for 10 years, had suddenly backed a coalition of emerging designers. Arya Design was at the top of that list. They called it a rebranding of American design presence in Europe. I never publicly claimed to be the leader behind the shift, but the press started calling me the silent challenger to the Moreland empire. At Moreland headquarters, the bad news kept coming, like paper cuts Charles never saw coming. The leather supplier fell through, the Vienna showroom was snapped up by a Korean firm, then came the $1 million tech contract in Munich, suspended indefinitely due to supply chain risk reassessment. A former colleague told me the latest board meeting at Moreland was tense like never before. Charles had shouted at the CFO, slammed documents on the table, and accused someone of sabotage from within. What he didn't know was no one was sabotaging him. He was simply facing the consequences of underestimating others, and the very daughter-in-law he once called a failed woman in a dress. One weekend afternoon, as I was with my team fine-tuning designs for the Rose Hotel in Charleston, my phone rang. It was Ethan. I paused, staring at the screen. It had been almost 3 weeks since we last spoke, when he left our apartment with a suitcase and bitter words trailing behind him. "I'm here," I answered, keeping my voice calm. "Tomorrow night," Ethan said after a pause, "my father's hosting a family dinner. He's invited the entire board, the major shareholders, and he's asked for you to be there." I chuckled lightly. "Why, so I can sit quietly like a prop again?" "No," Ethan replied, his voice raspier than usual. "He knows everything, about Velliere, Milan, about Henry's support, and he wants to see you, in person. I'm not coming to hear him blame me for his own collapse." "Arya," Ethan hesitated. "He won't apologize, you know that. But he's shaken. You should come. Not for him, for yourself." I was silent for a moment. There was a time when I longed for an invitation to that table, the one reserved for decision-makers, for the powerful, for the people who thought they ran the world. Now, I didn't need their invitation, but I would go, not to be accepted, but to show them. I was no longer someone they could overlook. I hung up and looked around my new studio, where pencils scratched across paper and swatches of leather lay beside one another like notes in a score coming to life. I arrived at the Moreland estate on time, wearing a slate gray dress designed by my own studio, simple, tailored, with not a single unnecessary seam. Ethan was waiting by the door, his face carrying a mix of fatigue and unease. He opened the car door, but I declined. "I can walk in on my own." The Moreland mansion was just as grand as I remembered. Arched ceilings, marble floors, art perfectly placed like it had been measured by laser. But something was different this time. The air felt thick with unspoken tension. I stepped into the main dining room. Charles sat at the center of the table, surrounded by board members and a few key allies. When he saw me, his face stretched into a forced smile. "Arya," he said, like my name was a pill he had to swallow. "Thank you for coming." "I came because Ethan asked," I replied. "Not for you." A flicker passed through the room. Ethan pulled out a chair beside him and dinner began with stiff greetings and carefully rehearsed smiles. Throughout dinner, Charles went on and on about his plans to expand into Asia, a project he had just officially handed over entirely to Ethan. "Singapore will be our launch pad," Charles said, swirling the wine in his glass. From there we'll move into Tokyo and Seoul. Ethan will work directly with the investors in Hong Kong. Everything is lining up perfectly. I glanced at Ethan. He sat upright, his eyes focused but unreadable. He nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, like he was playing a role assigned to him in advance. So what's the plan for the two of you? A female board member asked, leaning toward me. Arya, are you still running your studio? Or will you be relocating to Asia with Ethan? I'm continuing to expand Arya Design in New York and Milan, I said, not even looking at Ethan. We don't plan to move together. The air in the room stiffened for a second. Charles set down his knife, a slight smirk appearing at the corner of his lips. That's unfortunate, he said. A wife who supports her husband can help build an empire. A woman who chooses her own path may only build a beautiful little tent. I smiled and raised my glass of water in place of wine. Sometimes, a little tent brings more peace than a castle full of pressure. After dinner, Ethan and I stood apart in the long hallway that led to the back garden. Lanterns shimmered above, their light falling softly on his shirt. The kind of expensive fabric I used to help pick out but now felt so foreign. You've really changed, Ethan said, his voice rough. You're no longer the woman who used to look at my father with pleading eyes. I looked him in the eye, and you've changed in the opposite way. You used to speak up when something felt wrong, now you nod at everything. Ethan didn't argue. He lowered his head, silent. Why did you take the Asia project? I asked. Because your father wanted you to, or because you truly believe in it? He inhaled deeply, then exhaled, staring into the shadows of the garden. I don't even know anymore, Arya. My father says it's a golden opportunity. If I succeed, I'll finally have a voice on the board. But sometimes, I feel like I'm just being moved out of the way so someone else can keep control. I placed my hand on the cold stone railing. You know, Charles never needed an heir. He needed someone willing to step back every time he stepped forward. Ethan turned toward me, his eyes full of confusion. I no longer felt the need to soothe. I don't blame you for listening to your father, I said gently. I just can't walk beside someone who's lost the sound of his own voice. He reached as if to touch me, but stopped. So, he asked, his voice almost breaking, does this mean we're going our separate ways now? I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him. This man who once led me through a snowstorm to propose on the rooftop of a greenhouse, now, trapped in the armor his father had forged for him. Ethan, I said at last, I can't pull you out of it, but I won't wait for you anymore. I turned and walked across the stone tiles I had once designed for the moorland garden renovation. Each step felt firm, like those stones no longer belonged to their house, but paved the way to my own future. Under the warm yellow lights of Chateau de Brissac in southern France, where Charles Moreland was hosting the 35th anniversary of Moreland Corporation, the air was full of laughter, clinking glasses, and toasts. This was his night to reassert his image after a string of quiet failures in Europe, and his chance to regain control. I entered with Henry dressed in a simple black gown with long velvet sleeves, elegant without being flashy. Henry walked beside me with composed grace, revealing no sign of tension. We weren't there to stir trouble. We were there to end a game that had been playing out for nearly a year. Charles stood at the center of the hall in a custom tuxedo. When he saw us, his eyes darkened, but he still stepped forward with a performative smile. Arya, he nodded. I'm surprised you accepted the invitation. And Mr. Gallagher, a pleasure. I came for Ethan, I replied calmly, and out of basic respect for the investors present tonight. Charles chuckled softly, but his eyes didn't match his tone. He turned away and launched into a lengthy speech about building legacies, pioneering innovation, and the Moreland family spirit. Every word was calculated, as if eloquence alone could erase recent failures. Then he raised his glass. We are proud to announce a long-term strategic partnership with Bryce and Lowell Capital, aimed at aggressive growth in Asia and sustained dominance in Europe. Applause echoed, almost as if the room had been programmed to respond on cue. Charles lowered his glass and looked directly at Henry and me. And tonight, I want to thank everyone who has challenged me. It's because of pressure from competitors that Moreland Corporation has grown stronger. I could see it. He couldn't resist taking a jab, but I was ready. Henry gently touched my arm as a signal. I nodded and stepped toward the microphone beside the stage. Excuse me, I began, my voice clear, steady. I have a small announcement to make on this special evening. Every head turned. Charles froze. He didn't stop me. He didn't believe I had the presence to humiliate him in public. For over a year, I said, Arya Design has expanded in New York, Milan, and now Tokyo, with strategic support from D&G Ventures, an investment firm founded by Mr. Henry Gallagher. And tonight I'd like to publicly state something Charles has always avoided. I turned and looked straight at the crowd. I am the daughter of Henry Gallagher. A wave of murmurs rippled through the ballroom. I didn't reveal this sooner because I wanted my achievements to stand on their own, not on the back of lineage, but tonight I need to clarify. Every withdrawn contract, every supplier shift was not luck. It was the result of a man who spent too long at the top without learning how to respect others. Henry stepped up beside me and calmly added, and as a final move, D&G Ventures officially withdraws all pending investments for Moreland Corporation's Asia project, effective immediately. Charles's face went pale. You don't have the right, he growled, stepping toward Henry. I do, Henry replied without raising his voice. Clause 14b, projects are subject to reevaluation if the investor identifies signs of governance failure or lack of transparency. The board members began whispering, the Bryce and Lowell reps frowned, pulling out their phones. I looked at Charles, the man who once sat above everyone else, deciding who was worthy. You once called me a mistake, I said softly, but your biggest mistake was underestimating someone in your own family. Ethan stepped forward. He said nothing. He simply stood between me and his father, his gaze clear. For the first time, he wasn't standing behind Charles. In that moment I knew, the game was over. Charles was escorted from the stage, and the board convened an emergency meeting in a private room nearby. The press buzzed behind the grand doors, but I no longer cared. I walked away, head held high, not in triumph, but because I no longer had to live in someone else's shadow. Paris after that night felt like waking from a dream. The lights along the Champs-Élysées still sparkled, but inside me was a strange quiet. Not relief, not pride, just emptiness. As if every emotion had already been spent, leaving me with a victory that didn't taste quite sweet. Charles Moreland was temporarily suspended by the board for 90 days, pending a full audit of all expansion projects and contracts. Major shareholders called for independent reviews. Headlines exploded. The fall of Moreland, power no longer untouchable. I thought that moment would bring me justice. But truthfully, what I felt most was exhaustion. I returned to New York 2 days later, turning down all interviews, press inquiries, and even offers from luxury brands that once ignored me. The Arya design office was still lit, the team hard at work finishing mock-ups for a boutique hotel in Florence. But the urgency in me was gone. That victory had cost too much. Back in the small apartment I moved into after leaving Ethan, I sat at my desk, a cup of tea in hand, untouched. The files from D&G Ventures were still there, along with offers to expand to Tokyo and Los Angeles. Everything I once dreamed of, within reach. And it was then I realized what I had left behind. Ethan. We hadn't spoken since the party, no text, no note, no official goodbye, but no effort to hold on either. We had simply drifted apart, like two trains that changed tracks long ago without admitting it. I had loved him, that never changed. But love doesn't keep someone who's already lost themselves. And maybe I had lost part of myself in the revenge too. That night, Henry came to visit. He brought 2 sandwiches and a bottle of light red wine. I'm not here to offer praise, he said, settling into the armchair across from me. I came to ask you one thing. I nodded. How do you feel after all of it? I looked him straight in the eye. I feel free, but also empty. Have you ever felt that? He chuckled quietly. Every time I won a bid and lost a good partner. Victory. Without someone to share it with. We sat in silence, the wine bottle still unopened between us. Henry reached out and gently touched my shoulder. You've walked a path most wouldn't dare take. But if I may give you one piece of advice, don't become another Charles. From now on live clearly, honestly. No more chess games, Arya. I smiled gently, not sad, not happy, just accepting. The next morning I emailed Henry to decline the Tokyo collaboration. I decided to pause expansion and focus on building Arya design into a space for nurturing creativity, not just for me, but for young designers chasing the same hope I once had. I moved the studio to a quieter part of Brooklyn and opened a new branch, Arya Lab, dedicated to nonprofit projects, community support, and sustainable design. I no longer wanted to fight for market share, I wanted to build. Months later, I received a postcard from Singapore. No name, just a familiar handwritten line. Hope you're still designing things that make this world a little more beautiful. I keep that postcard in my notebook, as a gentle reminder that not all endings are angry, some simply fade, to make space for what's next. Arya's journey was one of reclaiming her voice and true worth from a world that underestimated her. Though she won brilliantly and flipped the board, she also faced the cost of vengeance, a broken marriage and quiet loneliness. But instead of letting bitterness consume her, she chose transparency, creativity, and authenticity. That was her greatest win. What do you think about Arya's journey? Was she right to flip the game, or is there something you would have done differently? Share your thoughts below and don't forget to follow the channel for more powerful stories about family and life.